Hi everyone, my name is Shabbir Lakha. I'm here with Counterfire on International Women's Day, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Aghileh, who is an Iranian refugee and a political activist, and who's going to be telling us a little bit about the protests in Iran and what's been happening. Um, we've seen since I think it was September last year, after the kind of the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini, that there's been this uprising really in Iran with mass protests. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about kind of what's been happening.
So I think what has been really interesting, so in Iran, having protests is kind of normal, everyday stuff. There's always someone on strike. There's some protest or other over various things, but what's been really interesting about this particular one is that everybody has come together. So it wouldn't be surprising that people are protesting about not getting paid on time, particularly if you're a government employee. So this includes lots of different sections of the society. So if you're a teacher, if you're a lot of factories are owned by the government. So people on very, very small salaries, their salaries doesn't get paid on time. So people do protest a lot on those bases. But the difference has been that on this occasion, everybody across section society has come together. Of course, there are particular provenances where there has been more brutality over the years. It's been much bigger. And I suppose you could argue that those are places where people have nothing to lose. So if you're living in Kurdistan or Sistan and Baluchistan, all of these areas are areas where there has been severe oppression over many, many years. And therefore, I suppose those people are more likely, particularly their young people, to go and join the protest. I think I don't want to compare places, but I suppose sometimes, the similarities with Palestine is interesting. So, in the Gaza Strip, all the young people are always in the streets, and you kind of almost feel like, why are they doing it? And actually, they're doing it because they don't have any hope, and there isn't, and they're literally wanting the last thing they have is their lives, and that's what they're offering. So it's quite an emotional and overwhelming thing. But the positive, if there is one, that happened out of Mahsa Amini's, that at the very least we can call it an unlawful death, was that I think it crystallized in everybody's mind that, because previously you would speak to people and that people would say, if you're not political, if you don't do this or you don't do that, then you can have a nice life. But then actually, she literally was going about her everyday business. And this really, and I think that really hit home with people, that in a brutal regime like that, everybody is a target. And one thing that I think people don't really talk about very frequently is the class element of this. So if you're in Iran, whoever you are, you're oppressed. So I always give the example of my father. He is the equivalent of a white middle class man. He is a man. He is Muslim. He is Shia Muslim. He doesn't belong to any kind of marginalized ethnic groups, and yet for his political beliefs, he was in prison for 5 years. So that exists. But having said that, there are particular groups that are targeted for their ethnicity, for their religious groups. So, for instance, if you're a Sunni Muslim, you're targeted. If you belong to the LGBT community, you're targeted. If you're Kurdish or you belong to Baluchistan, you're targeted. And this is and the class element of it is that if you're rich, the rich people in North Tehran are less likely to get stopped because they're traveling in their cars. So they're less likely to get stopped to say, oh, lady, your scarf is not properly done or whatever. Whereas the poor people who are using public transport are those people who are more likely to get stopped, to get asked about their attire. So there's a strong class element in this that I hope that it hasn't been missed by at least the Iranians, if not people outside. As far as what is going on at the moment, things had really they'd gone quiet a little bit. And I kind of it's completely to be expected, because a revolution, I read it somewhere that the revolution is a marathon, it's not a sprint, because, and I think there's something really important in that. I don't think, because they have all the power and we only have us. They've got the guns, they've got the mechanisms to control the internet, all of these things. So you really need to give yourself a break, take time to regroup, to re-energize and go out again. But in the last few weeks, there's been massive incidents of girls getting poisoned in schools. A strange sort of gas goes in and there's lots of poisoning of girls. I really don't know, and there's no clear evidence how it has happened. The regime is saying it's outside forces. To be honest, I think it doesn't matter who has done it. It matters that it's a regime that has no control. If it is them, then this is evil and it's a crime and it's, it's unforgivable. If it is not them, then they have lost the grip. And actually, there are lots of evidence that they have lost the grip. I would never support Israel in any way, shape, or form. However, Iranian nuclear scientists get killed in broad daylight with guns and whatever, and it's very clear, it's very, very clear that it's coming from Israel. And if you have got to a stage where a foreign power comes and kills people within your system, then you've lost the grip. And I think that's really important. And I think that's the thing to remember, that it doesn't matter if this has slowed down. And even the Iranian revolution, from the beginning to the end, it took about a year and a bit. And I think, and this was at a time where financially people were much better off. So they were not struggling for their day-to-day existence. And now that's a real issue. So I think it would take time, but change is coming, because it feels like a tree that has, it's completely broken from inside. It's gone. But it will take time. I don't think it's something that will happen overnight. But I really, for the first time after 30 years of living in this country, I really believe that there will be a day where I can go and live in Iran again. So I'm really hopeful. But what I would say is, what is incredible is, on this International Women's Day, is that, I mean, this is not new. In Iran, women have been at the forefront of many things always. But they really have been at the forefront of this revolution, this movement. It's amazing. So there's a young woman called Hadith Najafi. She died not very long after Mahsa Amini's death. She was shot 6 times to the head and the neck. The last voice note that she left, I think, I'm not quite sure whether it was to a friend or her mum. And she was saying that she was scared, but she was going, and she was hoping that maybe in a few years she would be happy that she had participated in this revolution, and she would have freedom. And I think, and it's incredible. So you would have, the father of Mahsa Amini has talked about that they don't feel alone. They feel that they've got, he said that all Iranian children are his children. And actually, I think the Iranian young people have done him proud. They have, because of the death of their daughter, they've been out time and time again. And I think they're setting a great example globally because people like us who are living in Britain, and we are facing a different type of oppression by our government, by the capitalist system. And, you know, that day when it's cold and we don't want to go to that demo, it has really influenced me. Or that day when it's really difficult to strike because people are putting pressure on you. You have to remember that actually other people are risking their lives and doing these things. And okay, it's really hard here as well, but it's a different scale of hardship. And it does give you inspiration. And I hope it gives inspiration to a lot of people internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, my next question was going to be about the role of women. We've kind of covered that, but it is absolutely inspiring. I mean, particularly, I remember seeing videos of like schoolgirls, you know, in their school challenging the, you know, the Revolutionary Guard and stuff, which is, yeah, it's really something. Do you think that the movement has kind of generalized or reached kind of wider sections? Because, you know, initially it was very much about you know, the religious police and the role of the state in policing women's bodies. But it seems to have kind of slightly moved on into a general question of democracy and other things. And, you know, there's been participation of groups of men, of strikers, I think. Yeah, I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about kind of the shape of the movement and the demands and kind of how it's grown?
Very difficult to say what type of, you know, because it's not like there are surveys done in Iran about who's participating in the demonstration. But in terms of geographical locations, it's all provenance. It has been all provenances. And again, I want to reiterate that there are some who are at the forefront, like so Kurdistan, Sistan, Baluchistan. These are places where, you know, it has been, people have been particularly brave, and they've been planning out day in, day out, and it's incredible. But as far as, you know, I really want to emphasize to people, the Iranian people, you know, again, no surveys done, but the majority are born Muslim. And the Iranian people, even if we say that a lot of people have lost their faith, if you're in a place where almost 90-something% of the population is of one heritage, most people would have, so I would guess like maybe 50%, or even, so there's a large proportion of people who still do believe in some form or other. So to think that this is something about religion or headscarf or whatever, the issue of the headscarf is that this is a symbol of oppression. It's not that people are bothered about you know, of course it's irritating. You don't believe in covering your hair and people are telling you how to dress. Of course it's really irritating. But if that was the only thing, I don't suppose people would have gone out to get killed. You don't put yourself out there to get killed over a head covering. If that was the case, we would have seen it in other places. But that's not the reason. People are, it's just an excuse. And and the headscarf, it's a really symbolic thing for the regime, because they see it as the symbol of the Islamic government of Iran. And that's why that's the thing that gets people out. But actually, what people talk about is very, very clear. The chants are all around wanting democracy. People are also very clear that they do not want to go back to the past. So this idea that they want to go back to the Pahlavi regime, or this is all nonsense. People do not, there are lots of people in the West, Iranians in the West, in the diaspora, and they have every right to express what they wish. But the majority of people in Iran do not want to go back to pre-1979 revolution. The 1979 revolution didn't happen because there was a benevolent king and then people just went mad one morning and decided to get rid of him. It was not like that. It was an incredibly oppressive regime. And just because something more oppressive has followed, it does not mean that people want to go back to that. One of the most popular chants is death to the dictator, whether clergy or monarch, meaning it's a very clear reference to the previous regime. And actually, so one of the big demands of this movement has been around political prisoners and political executions and executions in general. And the previous regime had executed many people, maybe not as many as this regime, but that still doesn't. So I think if I would like it, it's very clear, if you listen to the chants, if you speak Farsi, even in a minimal sense, if you watch these videos, I'm not saying never, but there is it's very clear that people are asking for democracy and nothing other than that. So to think that we're going back to some pre-revolution era of monarch or whatever, I think that's nonsense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously we get a slightly distorted picture here in Britain, and then some of the people supporting the protest here do want to go back to Pahlavi, and I know they see Pahlavi's son as some kind of figurehead or whatever. But I mean, and I guess it's hard to tell, but do you know if there is any kind of true leadership within the movement on the ground in Iran, or any kind of direction or political feeling?
So I think the strength and the weakness of this movement is that there isn't a strong enough leadership. The strength of it is that then if there is centralized leadership, you can always put pressure on that centralized leadership, and then you stop people. But the weakness is then, where do you go? And setting direction and setting vision. And that's something that's definitely lacking. On the other hand, because it has carried on the length it has, it must have some sort of an internal mechanism that it's leading it, because internet has become really limited. So it's not like people are WhatsApping each other and letting each other know. So there must be some other mechanism that people get out and they go and demonstrate. So I don't think there is leadership in the kind of a conventional way that we think about leadership, but there must be some sort of centralized mechanism whereby there's some sort of a direction set, at least in terms of organizing demonstrations, in terms of organizing strikes. There are also trade unions. I mean, the activities of trade unions are really, really limited because of exactly for that reason. There's so much pressure on them. And their leaders don't last in the outside world very often. They're often in prison, the leaders of big unions. But I am hoping, and I think others as well are hoping, that in time there will be a leadership growing from inside the movement, from inside Iran, because that's exactly, I think it's really important for us in the West to amplify their voices, but I think the demands really need to come from inside of Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know if there's kind of much of a left in Iran who are kind of part of the movement or organizing?
Yeah, I mean, left has been a big part of. Historically, people talk about three groups coming together in order for change to happen. Whenever Iranian movements have been successful, then the nationalists, not in the kind of British sense of nationalism, but people who want independence for their own country. They don't want outside interference. They're not racist. They are people who really want independence and from any external forces. And the leftists and kind of what I guess we would call in the West modern Muslims, the people who are believers of Islam, but not in a very not in a kind of oppressive traditional sense that is viewed by the West. So when these three groups come together, normally that's when change happens. And I think that's one of the so the left has always been a big part of the movement. So one of the reasons I don't really know. So we are getting really close to an anniversary of the nationalization of the oil industry by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. So one of the reasons that the CIA, as well as losing a lot of money, of course, but one of the reasons that MI6 and CIA, with the help of Pahlavi regime, organized a coup against him was they saw him as a propaganda of the Soviet Union, and it was so far from the truth. He just wanted a fair deal, some sort of social justice system, and actually he was Muslim, and it came. You could argue that some of it came from his Muslim faith about, just society. But yeah, I mean, there has always been a very strong leftist movement in Iran.
That's really interesting. I guess the last question I want to ask is kind of in terms of us here in Britain and how we can support the movements. Because I mean, like you mentioned, the West has always played this interfering role, not just in Iran, but in the Middle East and wider. And we've seen the kind of hypocrisy in how they initially cover the protests, while maintaining this brutal sanctions regime and oppressing Muslim women here, for example. And we saw, people in France, for example, like burning headscarves and stuff, not for really out of kind of supporting the autonomy of women, but for their own Islamophobic reasons and the rest of it. So, and like you were saying, that there are some within the kind of Iranian diaspora who are often kind of leading in some of the protests here, who do want to return to the Pahlavi regime and stuff. So how can we kind of navigate this difficult situation here in Britain in terms of showing solidarity with the people of Iran and the women of Iran and not kind of supporting our government's imperialism?
I think it's hard. It's a really hard balancing act. I have to admit that I have not been to a demo for months now, because I really find the struggle. I will not be standing next to people who are supporting a really regressive monarchy led by a monarch who is not even prepared to admit to the crimes of his own father. I mean, absolutely, I find it a struggle. And it was interesting. I was speaking to a young person who has just recently come from Iran, well, effectively ran away from Iran, and he was asking, is the UK full of Iranian monarchists? And I said, that hasn't traditionally been my impression, but I think what it is like, how you get a few football hooligans and then the whole world thinks all British public are football hooligans. It's because they are people who are able to make lots of noise. That's the bottom line. So I met people in the demos who were monarchists, and just the way they were, I was not able. I had to because I always take my young children to the demos, and I don't want to be around that kind of violence and aggression, and so people get away. But actually, solidarity is quite easy. What you do, this is what I think. If I was just, kind of British and have no Iranian heritage, I would go and look at the list of people who are who have been killed and read their life stories. There are plenty of it in English. And maybe if you're active on Twitter or social media or whatever, every so often put up one of their stories. Some of them are incredibly tragic stories, and put them up and talk about them. Also, I think if you want this to succeed, the only way this will succeed is if it's done by the Iranian people and no interference from the outside, because actually the regime is quite keen on outside interference, because every time you would see this, people like the son of the previous monarch or Mahsa Amini or people like that speaking, the regime then goes and says, you see, we said so, it's from the outside. It suits them. It's a thing. If you are running a dictatorship, having external enemies is a really helpful thing to suppress your own people. So none of that is helpful. Those people are not helpful to this movement. So what people need to do is just kind of to offer solidarity, to attend marches, put pressure on their MPs to remove sanctions. Sanctions, for the most part, have just crippled the Iranian people. Hungry people don't demonstrate very well. You need to be quiet. It's really, really difficult to demonstrate with hungry when you're hungry. People who are worrying about their next meal, it's very difficult for them to participate in resistance. So if you really are interested in regime change, and if you're really interested, and I suppose regime change is not a very good word, if you're really interested in people achieving democracy, achieving what they want, is to put pressure on our government to remove sanctions and offer solidarity, amplify their voices, look at the list of people who have died, look at the list of people who are in prison and in danger of getting executed, and publicize them, particularly if you're on social media and you have lots of following, because actually that kind of external pressure does work. But if you think, if you didn't think that external interference is a bad thing, surely that after Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, I think it's surely that has now tells you that it will not, it never ends well. It really never ends well. And so it's really important to pressurize our governments to make sure they remove sanctions. On the other hand, also put pressure on the Iranian regime by publicizing people whose lives are in danger or they have been executed unjustly. Actually, executed in general, but particularly unjustly. So that's what I would recommend people do. But also, we've just started off, some of us with some are Iranian, some are non-Iranian, most are trade union backgrounds. We've set up a group called, that we've got a website, and it's called socialistiran.org. Please go and have a look. We often put articles, people go and talk, and it's all from a very left trade unionist background. And I think it's important to support these causes, but make sure that do not support the imperialist cause. The imperialist cause does not help the Iranian people. It never has. It never will. And actually, Iranian people are justifiably very paranoid because it wasn't that long ago when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh's government collapsed after a coup orchestrated by MI5 and CIA. So it has very fresh history in Iran.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think it's been really, I think it's really good that we were able to talk about this and highlight it and take inspiration from it on International Women's Day. And I'll include the link that you mentioned in the description. I think that's really useful. And yeah, thank you so much for taking your time out today to speak to us.
Thank you. Thank you.